ReSharper comes with a number of architecture tools, including diagrams. There's a project dependency diagram and a type dependency diagram. Let's start with the project dependency diagram. I have a solution here where I have multiple projects and some solution folders and so on. And what I want to see is a visualization of the project dependencies between those projects. So I want to see whether the samples web application depends on common, for example. Now, what I can do is, let me close the Solution Explorer here. What we can do is go to the ReSharper menu, Architecture, and then show Project Dependency Diagram. And you will get exactly that, a dependency diagram of all the projects in your solution and how they relate to each other. On the left-hand side here, you can select the elements that should be visible on the project diagram. So we can remove that one. Not interested in tests, for example, and the diagram will update based on what you select there. Everything is grouped by solution folders, but you can also select file structure or some other grouping options if desired. You can zoom and expand. So if you want to zoom on one project and see what's going on, you can do that. And you can also right-click any project that is in there and select some of the other options that are available. So what you can do is, for example, filter everything to this command line application, but also all referenced or dependent projects on this specific project. So let's go with referenced and see which projects are referenced by our command line projects. We have that now. Our command line project depends on space.client and on space.common after that one. In the toolbar here, you will see that a couple of options are selected by default. So there's coupling analysis, there is transitive references. I will dive into those two in a bit. There's also some options to show a diff between multiple diagrams. So if you do a huge refactoring, you can see what is going on between those refactorings. You can show possible paths if there's multiple references between different projects. You can collapse this graph so you can see the big solution folders instead of all the projects. You can, of course, open it again and expand into all of the things that are available. You can export as a PNG. You can export to GraphML, and there's an export to XPS as well if you want to include this in architecture diagrams or somewhere on a Slack message or a space message or something like that. This coupling analysis and the transitive reference analysis are the arrows that you see here. So you will see how coupled two projects are. So for example, our command line project is linked to space.client, but the arrow here is smaller than the one between client and common. It means that client has more references to common types than samples has on this client project. If you hover one of those arrows, you will see how many usages are there. So you see this one has 100,000. The samples one has only 73. So that's why the arrows are different in width. You can see the usages by right-clicking and showing usages. And this will open up all of the references between those projects in a tool window where you can start filtering. A very nice thing is that everything is also grouped by not only project structure, which is a default, but also by how the types are used in those different projects. So you can see that there's direct usages from command line to some of the other projects that are there in this line of code, this line of code, this line of code, and so on. You can also see that we have some indirect usages where some type is doing a call into another type that then has the reference. There's invocations, there's read and write access, so you can really easily find out how a project depends on the other project that is there. Now let's go back to our diagram and show all of the elements from our solution again. And you will see that between some of the projects here, actually this one, authentication to ASP.NET Core, there's this dotted line. The dotted line means that there's a transitive dependency. So this project depends on this project, but not by explicit use, but by implicit use. So for example, because we're using a type that both of these projects use, in some case, we have a link between those projects. To optimize our solution, it may make sense to make a proper explicit reference between authentication and ASP.NET Core, but of course that depends on what you want to do. The good thing here is that we can see the coupling, and if you want to start refactoring, maybe unlink two projects from one another, you can find here in this diagram how they are connected and how many usages are there that you may want to optimize using show usages, for example. Another diagram that we have is the type dependency diagram, and you can actually open that from here, see how types are related, and then show the type dependency diagram for this space.client project, for example. More interesting is when you do this from within code. So I have a interface, which is iSpace webhook handler. We can navigate there. And from here, we can show that type dependency diagram. We can do that using Alt-Enter. And as you may know, everything in ReSharper at least is searchable, and Alt-Enter is not different. So what we can do here is search for type dependency diagram, and you will see that we can open up a type dependency diagram for this specific interface. Let's do that. Wait for the diagram to render, and there we are. So we now have iSpace webhook handler as the only element on our type dependency diagram. So the next thing we probably want to do is add all reference types, all of the types that we reference from within that iSpace webhook handler. And using this approach, you can essentially expand all of the different references to a given type and see how they interact with one another. Now, this is becoming a very large diagram, but again, it serves to visualize how classes relate to one another, and it actually also allows you to refactor those dependencies. So what I can do from here, from this diagram, is again export, make it an image and things like that. But the more interesting thing from here is that we are looking at our application's type hierarchies and the architecture of the application. And from here, using either the shortcuts or again using the context menu, you can even refactor this and, for example, move this iSpace webhook handler to a different folder in our solution and invoke that refactoring inside of ReSharper. So in summary here, both diagrams let you investigate the coupling between projects and between types, and they really serve to better understand or improve the solution architecture by optimizing references or maybe refactoring certain types or type hierarchies. Let's talk about the Localization Manager in ReSharper. In Visual Studio, you already have support for resource files and localization of applications, but ReSharper adds the Localization Manager to give you a single grid where you can add, edit, rename, and refactor localizable strings in your application, but also spot missing localized values. So this solution here has many projects, and most of them are localized in many different cultures. So you will see this project, for example, has, where are they? It has languages, pretty much every language, well, not every language in the world, but still a couple of localized cultures are available in this solution, and it's a lot. Using ReSharper, there's a window under the Windows menu there. We can open the Localization Manager and have a look at all of the different resource files across our solution and across all of the projects that are there. Let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see what's there. So for example, for our ShareX project, we had different cultures and different resource files for all of the different forms and controls and properties that are in there. And you will see that most of them, like these minimum sizes and maximum sizes in forms and controls, are in the default culture, but not yet in German, not yet in Spanish, Mexican, and so on. So we may want to localize those if needed. A more interesting one is probably going to be in some of the other libraries that are there that actually have localizable strings as well. So this update message box has a name, has a status, has resources, and so on. And there's also going to be some file path labels that are being used in there. So here we can see that file paths exists in the default culture. It exists in German, it exists in Spanish, and so on. So we can look at all of those in here. And by having this different coloring, we can immediately spot which resources need translations. Now, of course, this is a lot of information. And again, like many of the tool windows in ReSharper, you can group and restructure the information that you're looking at. So for example, we can group instead of by project structure, we can group by directory or just have no grouping. What you can also do is from here, choose the cultures that you want to work with. So ReSharper will detect all of the different cultures that are being used in your application. And maybe all you're interested in is the default culture, and let's go with French as well. If we do that, our view will immediately filter and we will only see 2 languages there. Another filter that exists is one where we can only see the cultures that need translation. So we can enable that, and you will see that all of these need translation in French. There's a couple of other filters that you can apply here as well. More interesting is probably going to be that you can export this to CSV or import from CSV. This is especially handy if you are working with external translators for your application. You can export all of your resources. They can translate it in Excel, for example, and then you can import it back using ReSharper. Some other things that are here is adding of new cultures. So what we can do is, for example, add Flemish, which is going to be NLBE, my native tongue. You can add that culture, and what ReSharper will then do is add resource files in all of the projects that we have here. So I'm not going to do this in the interest of having a more speedy demo, but this will add a new resource file across all of the files or across all of the projects that we have here. Localization Manager also gives you integration with the editor. So let's open up this program.cs here, and you will see that I have a console.writeLine that says hello world, which is not the most interesting demo, but it is a localizable message, and ReSharper will actually underline this and tell us that this is a localizable string, hello world. Why is this detected as being localizable? Well, I'm doing a console.writeLine, which means this is something that the user will see in the end. So it means that we may want to localize this. So what you can do is Alt-Enter, move this to resource, and ReSharper will give you the option to extract this hello world string into a resource file and then refactor everything there. What's also interesting is that the localization manager will pop up, and we can immediately see that we have hello world and that value, and that we now need to translate it in French as well. From the editor, you will also see that if you Alt-Enter, you can edit with localization manager and start working on this specific resource if needed. A couple of other things that are there is that you can also refactor this. So for example, if you want to move this resource to another resource file, you can do so, and ReSharper will update everything. You can rename a resource, or you can even save delete the resource. So for example, if I'm almost sure that nowhere else in the application the string hello world is being used, I can invoke save delete resource, and ReSharper will tell me if it is actually safe to delete this resource or not. And it will tell me once it's finished analyzing all of the resource files that we have there. But it makes sense because it will give you some more information about whether the resource is still being used or not. So you'll see here, I canceled this, but you will still see that it's being used here. So that was just a very quick overview of the localization manager we have. In the resources below this video, you will find a link to some blog posts that we have and web help, where we have many other things to show you. ReSharper helps you speed up coding and helps you write better code more fast, but it also helps you build your application much faster than traditionally in Visual Studio. So what I will do is from the ReSharper menu, go to Windows and then show ReSharper Build, which is under Build and Run. And I'm just going to enable ReSharper Build and then explain what is happening. So the first thing you will see is that ReSharper Build, once enabled, has the overview of the solution, and every single project has this big colored representation in this tool window. What ReSharper Build will do is that it will build our solution in parallel where possible. So if there's no dependencies between one project and another project, it may build those at the same time. But ReSharper will also detect where you are making changes and whether a full rebuild of the application is needed. So what I'm going to do is build this solution, and we'll wait for it to finalize. And you will see that the first time we invoke ReSharper Build, all of our projects will be built, and you will see that the green ones actually needed updating. Now, I built this project before, and you will see that, for example, Share X, our main project, has been skipped if you hover this one, because that did not have to be rebuilt because no changes were made in there that were public and might affect some other projects that we had in our solution. Now, if we go into some ShareX file, let's open Capture Monitor, which is a file in that project, and just make a small change there. Maybe make this a var instead of a rectangle, instead of the actual type. What we can do is, again, compile using ReSharper Build, and you will see that all of the projects will be skipping builds, but only our ShareX project will be rebuilt. So this makes building much, much faster. There's a couple of other options that we can specify in ReSharper Build, and I'll show those while we wait for this build of the ShareX projects. A couple of options are there in terms of how many processes you want to have running to build your application when ReSharper Build is enabled. So by default, we have a default that looks at the amount of CPUs you have and will optimize based on that. If you want more parallelization of builds, you can increase this number. If you want less parallelization, you can also change that number. There's a couple of other options as well, whether you want to have NuGet packages restored before build or not. You can write to a log file so you can get some insights into why ReSharper is deciding to build one project or not. But all of those things really serve to speed up the build of larger solutions that have multiple projects. Very often you will have a solution that has multiple projects that you can run. In Visual Studio, you can either run the current project by using the context menu and then selecting Run or Debug from there. Or you can edit the solution and manage your startup projects and set multiple projects to start. Now, obviously, if you have multiple startup projects, the last thing you want to do is continuously go into this dialog and change the projects that will be running. But also the last thing you want to do is invoke every project from the context menu one by one. ReSharper comes with the concept of run configurations to speed all of this up. So again, from our build tool window in ReSharper, what you can do is specify multiple run configurations. By default, ReSharper will detect that you have the one that Visual Studio will run, but you can add multiple of your own. Now, I could do this from the tool window there. What you can also do is make use of the shortcut Ctrl+Shift+A, and that will give you an overview of all of the run configurations that are available. Now, before I started recording, I already created a ShareX console application run configuration. And using the shortcut, I can now quickly decide which projects I want to run or debug. You can also open up this menu and maybe run, maybe debug, maybe profile, maybe do memory profiling or just regular profiling, and so on. I can run them from here, and I can also add new run configurations. Run configurations can be executables, so any executable that you have in your system. So maybe if you want to run an emulator you need for your application to run, you can create a run configuration for that. If you just want to launch a project, you can obviously do that as well, or you can define run configurations as static methods. I'll look at those in a minute. Let's just look at launching a project in here. So each run configuration will require a name, and we can call this one demo, for example. And then we can select a project that we want to run as part of this run configuration. So let's go with console as well and pick run as the default action. We can save this, and again, using our Ctrl+Shift+Alt+R shortcut, we can now run our demo or debug ShareX or debug the console application from here. Now notice that I specified that run should be the default. So here you will see that demo will run by default, but ShareX was configured to debug by default. So this will be a debug configuration by default. One last thing I want to show here in terms of run configurations is that in the run configuration, you can also choose to share run configurations. Let me actually open up that dialog again. So what you can do is share these using ReSharper settings files. So if you have multiple configuration and you want to share them with people who are on your team, you can actually go in the menu here, click share, and then ReSharper will store this on disk so you can commit it to your Git repo, and then other members of your team will be able to run that run configuration as well. Now, I mentioned that run configurations can be executables, projects, or static methods. Probably you don't want to configure this one manually, but what you can do is if you have any class, and in this case it's program, but if you have any class that has a public static method, you can always run that method using ReSharper. So what will happen is if I Alt-Enter here, on our method, of course, is that we can debug these methods. And what this will do is create a temporary run configuration to run just these methods. And that's really easy to quickly debug or step into some code that you want to try out. So we can run these methods. Another thing that you can do from here is create a run configuration. If this is something you want to do more often, you can store it so that, again, it will show up using that run configuration pop-up menu. In this case, I can just run it, and you will see that I get some DNS information collected, but you will see no output, but it will run these methods. So all in all, run configurations serve to be able to quickly jump between projects you want to run, quickly debug a specific project, so that you can actually try it out and quickly switch between those projects. So whenever you compile a .NET language, your source code will usually be compiled to intermediate language, or IL, but not to machine code immediately, because the IL code that is being generated can be executed on multiple target platforms. Can run on Windows, can run on Mac, maybe 64 bits, maybe 32 bits, and so on. So the compiler will actually optimize that just in time, which is the just-in-time compiler that will compile the intermediate language to actual machine codes that can be run. Now, one of the interesting things in ReSharper and .peak as well, our decompiler, is that you can explore this decompiled IL code. It's really good for learning. I would probably not dive in there unless really needed, but still it's nice to see. So what you can do is use the menu, but in here I'm going to use Ctrl+Shift+A as a shortcut to search for an action, and we can already see that the IL viewer is there. I could also search for it, and you can see IL viewer there. We can open it, and in the tool window that opens, you will see the IL representation of the file that you're currently looking at. So we can see our example methods, and our example method is this entire section of IL codes. By clicking statements, you will immediately see which statement corresponds in the IL tool window, because it highlights this line in codes and it highlights this part in the intermediate language viewer. This may look cryptic, but it's really documented, because IL is obviously a standard, and you can hover these commands in IL and look at what they mean. So this is, for example, loading a value from the stack, this one as well, or pushing a value to the stack. So we can hover over those and see what every instruction means. One of the things that we can see here is that we are boxing a variable. In this code example, what we are doing is we are allocating an integer as a value type, but then we are allocating an object because we are boxing our integer into an object. We are really putting an integer, a value type, into a reference type, which is our objects. Well, you may not notice this immediately in codes, especially if you're using var or any of the new C# language features. But in the IL viewer, you will see this box statement, which actually tells you that you are boxing an integer into a value, into a reference type. So that's really useful to look at those. But again, this is really good for learning or for optimizing performance critical codes, but probably you don't want to Spelunk your IL viewer code all the time. So what you can do is install the heap allocations viewer extension to also look at, for example, these boxing statements. ReSharper has a very rich extension manager that you can open, and there is an extension named the heap allocations viewer, which will show up in a second. There we are. And once you install that one, you will get additional inspections and quick fixes to optimize or at least detect hidden allocations in the source code that you may have. I already installed it beforehand, and you will actually see that this boxing statement that we had before is underlined with this red full line. And if we hover it, you will see that this is a boxing allocation because we have a conversion from integer to objects. So this makes it also really easy to spot those potential hidden allocations that may matter in your source codes. Obviously, the IL viewer nor this heap allocations viewer extension are a good substitute for actual profilers. So whenever you have a profiling problem or a memory issue, or you want to just inspect what is going on in your codes, you can make use of .memory or .trace if you have the .ultimate pack for ReSharper. And you will find those from the ReSharper profile menu. So you can start profiling or you can start memory profiling. Another profiler that we have and that runs continuously if you enable it is DPA, which is Dynamic Program Analysis. And that will give you information about potential memory allocation issues that you have in your project. I didn't run this beforehand, but again, this tool we know will give you some information about those, and I really encourage you to explore those on your own. ReSharper comes as a Visual Studio extension, but it's not only a Visual Studio extension. It ships as a set of standalone command line tools that you can run outside of the IDE, for example, on your CI server or whenever you are validating your source codes on the command line. There are several command line tools available. There is inspect codes. Let's open that tab here. There's inspect code, which is a command line tool that will allow you to run all of the inspections that ReSharper has in Visual Studio, but from the command line. And it can give you a report about where your code may be improved or where you may be able to use new language features and all that. There's the dupe finder command line tool. This one will hunt your source codes and read everything that is in there to find code duplicates, duplicated code in your solution or project, and will give you hints about where you can refactor your codes and make your code base more maintainable in the end. There's also cleanup codes as a command line tool that you can run, and cleanup code, what it will do is it will check your code styles and will run reformatting based on the formatting settings that your project has. So if you want to make sure that your sources are always formatted in the same way, you can configure this in ReSharper, export those settings, and then use the cleanup code command line tool on your CI, for example, to optimize everything and format it nicely, even if not everyone on a team may be using ReSharper. So make sure to check out these command line tools. There's a couple of them available. There's extensive documentation, and I really encourage you to explore those after watching this video.